Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And today we're going to begin a tale of somewhat what I call our antique buildings. Now, this is rather an odd story because while we are a city that can trace its ancestry back to 1559 or then to 1698 and then beyond, we have precious few really old structures. And in these episodes, we want to tell you a little bit about some of those that have been the most prominent and have had some little place in the history of the community. Of course, we can look at the areas right now that are prominent in residential reconstruction, particularly up on North Hill, where we have a wonderful series of buildings that were built anywhere between 1880 and the early part of the 20th century, and where a North Hill Preservation Society has done wonderful work in bringing those buildings back to look just like what they did back when they were constructed in the great part of the lumbering era. But from the buildings that are actually our oldest, we have to turn to some replicas first of all. Now, one of the buildings that we can remember most of in our history here was the Panton and Leslie warehouse. This was down on the waterfront. It was where the Panton Leslie trading post stored the materials that it traded with the Indians. It stood there for a good many years until it's burning not too many years ago, and we have today a little replica of it, just a miniature model actually, that is down on Main Street. It helps people understand where the warehouse was, and it gets an idea of what it looked like. Then we turn to an actual existing building, which is called the Julie Cottage. It's in the historic district down just east of Tarragona Street, and Julie was the slave of the fur trader Robert Panton, William Panton, and she was freed when Panton left the area in the year 1800, and he gave her $300 with which she bought this house, and of course she used it to great advantage, and happily it has been preserved. Next, we would turn to one of our premier preserved homes called the Barclay House. It stands on Main Street. The beautiful building, constructed probably about 1849 or 50 by a couple who were just settling in here to develop a trade business of their own. And Mr. Barclay was also a government commissioner. The house itself is kind of unique because it's called a Gulf High House. It follows a pattern that was very popular along the Gulf Coast, and particularly over near New Orleans, because if one would look at it, you can see that the living area is well raised above the water level in case storms should come. And the house has been restored a number of times and currently is the property of the Historic Village and the University of West Florida. Well, if we look in our historic district itself, which includes a great many buildings in the lower part of the city, there are many houses which were constructed anywhere from 1875 forward. Some of these are what are called shotgun houses. A shotgun house was one which got that title because it had a long hall that ran right from the entrance door on the front, and one could literally, as someone used to say, you could shoot a shotgun down that hall and not hit anything except the hall itself. All the rooms were off to the side. This was a very popular, inexpensive type of construction, and there are a good many examples here. But in the historic village, there are also a number of other much more pretentious homes, and these were popular places to live up until about the beginning of the 1880s, when people began to make more money and wished to have better housing. Well, there are of course, some other things that we want to look to downtown. Number one, of course, is Old Christ Church. This church was built as a multi-denominational effort between Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, and Episcopalians, all of whom pooled their resources and erected the church, and it became effective as the first Protestant church in all of Florida, and it became effective for use here in 1832. It was totally renovated not too many years ago with more than $1 million spent in the restoration, and it is a beautiful landmark for the city. Another building that doesn't exist anymore, I wish it did, but we had down at the corner of Palafox and Government Street in 1851, they erected the first federal building that we ever had built here in Pensacola. It was a combined customs house, courthouse, and post office. It was a wooden structure, 2.5 stories high, and it stood there for about 30 years. It burned in 1881 and then was replaced by a much larger 4-story sandstone building, which was erected again as a federal courthouse, and which the federal government continued to use up until the year 1939 and 40, when they traded that building to the county. And the county in turn traded to them the county courthouse, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. Now, other structures that came into being in the early part of the 1870s in the downtown area are typified by what we now call the Door House. This was built by the daughter of the Barclays, who had owned the Barclay House. The daughter was a widow. Her husband had worked for the large Simpson lumber mills over in Santa Rosa County. When he died, she used residue from his estate to build this lovely house for her family, and it has been beautifully preserved and is one of the landmark houses, one of the best looking homes that we have down in the downtown part of the historic district. Now, in 1885, we had what was probably the great landmark construction item of that time, and that was the building of the Pensacola Opera House. This was the product of an idea of the two banking brothers, the Sullivan brothers, and they built a huge building on the corner of Jefferson Street and Government. And the building was, first of all, on one corner to house their bank, and right in the center and above, of course, was to be the Opera House. And this building also had second floor space for other functions, and this is where, for a time, the Jewish Progress Club was located, and also beginning in 1889, this is where our first Chamber of Commerce had its office. The Opera House was magnificent. It began with about 1,000 seats. It was enlarged to have about 1,250, and for the next 35 years, this was the center of culture for our community. It was a beautiful building. Unfortunately, hurricanes damaged it seriously, so that it was razed in 1917. But happily, much of the brickwork and a lot of the interior trim was saved by the contractor who did the demolition work, and much of that material, including the brick, was used when they constructed the Sanger Theater about 7 years later. And when one walks down the street and looks at the Sanger today, much of the brickwork that you would see from the outside is still from the Opera House, and a lot of the decoration you would see as you look upward and around the walls on the interior of the theater itself, that again was taken from the Opera House. Well, if we look a little bit further, we can get another sample in downtown Penn, or in the North Hill area, of what the people began to do when they began to make money. And one of the best examples of this is on the corner of Balin Street and Strong. This is where the contractor Charlie Turner built his home that was to be his home, where he literally took his bride on their marriage night. The Turner house is a beautiful home right on the corner. It's painted gray today. It's owned by Turner's grandson Bill, who also owns the building just to the south of there along Balin Street, which Bill uses, of course, as a headquarters for his antique shop. Now, the Charlie Turner house is unique in that when he built it, he not only made a wonderful home for himself and his wife, but also he used that house as a kind of a showplace. And the story goes that he changed the interior staircase 4 times in the life of the house itself, because he wanted to be able to show people who are his potential customers for new homes just what was the latest thing to be built in new architecture, and he could take them inside and show them not only the construction styling, but also colors and fabric, and also the various types of woodwork that was available. And this was again Charlie Turner's his premier building, we would say, of all the things that he did. Another building that unfortunately does not exist anymore was known as Rayford Hall. Rayford Hall was built in the 1880s on North Balin Street to be a kind of a health club for some of the wealthy men of the area. It was later given to a civic organization, and they used it for basically the same services, and it had many different uses, but unfortunately it burned here in the 1980s. However, one can get a pretty good idea of what Rayford Hall looked like, because just a few years later, the Port of Pensacola, or rather the L&N Railroad, built a port office for itself right on the docks at the foot of Commandencia Street. And then in the In the 1980s, when port reconstruction was underway, the port had that building demolished a piece at a time, and then it was rebuilt along Main Street. And the building is now beautifully restored and is in use by an archaeological society. And certainly when one looks at that and then wants to have an image of what the Rayford Hall was like, the two are very much the same. Now, another thing that we want to look at, of course, downtown is a couple of the churches. They are certainly our antique buildings of distinction. Number one, of course, we would look at would be St. Michael's. St. Michael's was built by the Catholic diocese here in 1883. Charles Overman was the architect for this. It was a Spanish mission style, and at the time it was built, it cost over $33,000, which people thought was terribly extravagant. But as one can see, that church now has withstood the test of time, and after 125 years is a beautiful landmark downtown. Just up the street from there, of course, we have the second Christ Church. This is what a lot of people call New Christ Church. This was erected in 1903, once largely the Episcopal congregation had moved away from Old Christ Church, was moving steadily north, and led by the patriarch of the Bars family, money was raised, and Christ Church was erected in 1903. And of course, there have been many additions to this in other big structures to provide education and other things for that congregation since then. Moving just a little bit to the east of there, along Wright Street, one comes to the First United Methodist Church. This church was put there in 1910 once the congregation sold its properties, which had been right on the corner of Palafox and Garden Street. They sold their properties to the men who wanted to build the San Carlos Hotel. Mr. Bingham and Mr. Mulden gave the stewards of the Methodist Church $30,000 for their buildings and property, which the stewards subsequently invested in this beautiful new sanctuary, which unfortunately they overspent on, and it took about 20 years before the congregation had it all paid out, but restored on a number of occasions. It is a beautiful landmark building that certainly tells the story very well. Now, practically next door to that is what we call the Perry House. Now, the Perry House was built in stages. It was the dream of a Danish ship captain who came to Pensacola in the 1860s. He saw he saw the city of Pensacola. He thought this was a place he wanted to live. He bought this property and began construction, but unfortunately he died before it could be completed. It was sold, then sold again, sold a third time, and ultimately in the mid years of the 1920s, it was sold or given. There's a little bit of question on how that worked to the Masonic Order. And they in turn operated it as their home and headquarters until very recently, when it was sold to the United Methodist Church, which then the church stewards there, of course, have been in the process of remodeling it and the building would be used for church services and for many other purposes as well. Okay. Well, let's move down south on Palafox Street for just a moment, down up to just above where the auditorium used to be, where DeLuna Park has been established now. And we come on the east side of the street is a long, narrow house, which some people call the Bars House, some others call the Merritt House. But basically, it was a building erected in the early 1870s by Henry Bars as his office for his maritime agency. And he operated it for many years. But then in the early part of the 1990s, as Henry was moving into other areas, the Bars family sold it to John A. Merritt and Company, and Merritt and Company used it, of course, as their headquarters well up into the 1970s, when ultimately they sold out to an organization from Mobile. Unfortunately, the building has stood idle for some time, but it is still there, and a wonderful replica of the kind of business building that people like to associate with the lumbering era, because it was very functional, and of course in its time it had an available stairway down to the very water level so that people could bring a boat right up to the side of the building. Well, this gives us an idea of, in episode 1 here, many of the earlier buildings that were constructed here. In episode 2, we'll return and talk a little bit more about things of a little more modern era and how these have progressed.